I think people just don't like conversations such as like life and it's supposed to be I wonder if it's that. Obviously, because that's what they're doing.
And it's so stupid.
It's not even. People talk about death happily, and people will plan their funerals. People don't talk about
know that they're
people will have to
have to stop showing up.
I
Fell over a lot. Because that's very common.
I will happily sit in front of people and we'll talk about like, ooh, what's like the worst way to die? What would like how do you want to die? And like we'll talk about that, and people will sometimes talk about the afterlife without argument because they're like keep the religion out there. But people don't talk about grief, like specifically. And I know you can't talk about grief without death, but can you?
I was very much under the impression that okay, so the dynamic is Gemma has grieved or is grieving, and I am someone who has never and has so many questions around it. I still have those questions, but I've come to realise that I have experienced it. I am now, at least. Especially with conversations I've had with you and my mum as well about things over the past months. It's really opened up things, and I feel like I am processing things. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
I like that way of explaining it.
Thank you for coming. We hope you enjoy.
Dear Gemma, I think it's important that people are able to talk about their grief. However, when someone does talk about their grief to me, I have no idea how to respond. I feel awkward and I fear I'll say the wrong thing. There have been times recently where I have said the wrong thing. My partner lost her nan last year, and when she told me, I tried to make a joke. I said, I hope you find her soon. This made her cry immediately and reminded me of how insensitive and awkward I am surrounding the topic of grief. My grandparents died when I was young, so I feel I haven't really experienced grief, meaning I don't relate to people who are grieving. How do I talk to someone who is grieving? What should I say? What shouldn't I say? There's nothing I can say to make them feel better. There's so many things that I could say to make them feel worse. How do I comfort people going through it? Love, Victoria.
Dear Victoria, are you sure this is a conversation you want to have with me? We've only really been getting to know each other over the past month or so. This won't be a comfortable conversation to have with you. Love, Gemma.
Dear Gemma, I just want to know your thoughts. Because I know you've been through it. I feel like I don't know much about grief or loss. Love, Victoria.
Dear Victoria, just because you were young when your grandparents died doesn't mean you haven't grieved. Our brains aren't fully formed when we're little, so the grief is different.
When do our brains actually fully form?
If I remember rightly, our brains, they stop developing when we turn 25. It's why I often catch myself saying you start dying when you turn 25.
Start dying when you turn 25.
Kind of.
Right. So if we look at it in that way, technically, I've not really got that long until I start dying.
How old are you?
I'm nearly 23, so
A little bit over 2 years. It's plenty of time.
I lost my gran-gran when I was little as well. And I was confused at his funeral because I didn't understand why we had to be sad at a box that was covered in flowers. It's not my place to say, but maybe the way you feel is you revisiting the grief now that your brain can deal with it. In regards to what you said to your partner, I hope you are, or do get to a point in time, and you can look back and find it as funny as I do. I, for one, find that a better response than things like, I'm so sorry. But I can sympathise at saying that so close to the death probably wasn't funny at the time. I wouldn't call you insensitive either, though. The fact that you are aware of your awkwardness and care about how it might affect others, it shows your sensitivity to the topic. Maybe the problem you feel you have is you are separating the person who is grieving from a person. Yes, they are more sensitive because of the emotional deluge they're going through, but treating them as you would any other person will give them a sense of normality. Maybe even just ask them, what can I do to help? What do you need? Something so simple can make a huge difference. I personally always wanted to be asked to hang out and play when I was grieving. A short escape from my house and a moment of fun. But if that doesn't work, be honest and say you're not sure what to do. And most likely people will tell you what they need, even if that means leaving you alone for a little while. It's okay to be unsure about it.
It's life, ain't it?
Love, Jen. Dear Victoria, as I've not received another letter from you, I'm assuming my letter answered at the very least some of your questions. I hope me bringing my personal experiences into the letter wasn't too awkward. I'm not sure if you do have any more questions, but really take a moment. Think about if this is the way you want to explore your own grief. Love, Gemma.
Dear Gemma, I feel I'll be able to talk to you better through letters rather than face to face. Can we keep going with this? As long as we're both still comfortable. I know you don't know me that well, but are you okay with this? Love, Victoria.
Dear Victoria, I'm okay with this. Honestly, I'd quite like to be able to talk about grief more openly. So maybe this would be a good starting point. I'll wait for you to write me a letter about your feelings or opinions and then we can go from there. Love, Gemma.
Dear Gemma, I think it may be possible that I'm revisiting the grief now. I remember when my grandmother passed away, I was around 8. My dad would make us stay away from my mum when she was crying. Then, when family flew over for the funeral, me and my younger sisters were kept separate and were not allowed to go to the funeral. I felt we kept being pushed away, so I struggled to understand what we were supposed to do in this situation. Maybe if I had been exposed to how my family was feeling more closely, I would have a better understanding of grief already. But I also can understand my parents wanting to protect us and keep us away from what was happening. There's so much I don't know about my grandparents. There are stories I want to delve into, and I want to know more about their lives. Unfortunately, when I do ask questions about them, my mum, she can't seem to go into much detail. She gets upset. Talking about them makes her sad, so once we reach the point where she gets tearful, we stop. She often blames herself for my grandfather's death and struggles to talk about him. So my experience of talking about and going through grief is that we should ignore it, hide away from it, and don't talk about the person we have lost so that we can avoid the upset. Your suggestions about what to say to someone, they're really helpful. I guess on the other hand, it does depend on the person, like you said. Where you said you prefer to escape the house and have a moment of fun, others may simply want to be left alone. I think it's trickier, however, if somebody is experiencing denial about their grief or even anger. A question such as, what can I do to help, could be shot down with hostility, which is something I have experienced with friends. In this case, I would leave the person alone for a while until they felt able to talk. I feel grief is so complex and there's no one way to deal with it. Everyone's different. That's what's difficult for me, understanding how different people process things. I'm so unsure about how I process my own feelings, let alone how someone else's mind works. I feel like I'm rambling now, so I'll leave it there. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on denying grief or loss, or denying others to grieve. I do feel that I was denied the chance to process the loss of my grandmother. Or was it that I was just too young? How do you tell someone the bad news? Love, Victoria.
Dear Victoria, I hope that you get to learn more about your grandmother soon, either from your mother when she is able to talk, or through other means. I've never really thought about it much, but I think my family's approach to death, loss and grief has been odd compared to others, where I can sympathise with others' needs to protect kids from anything to do with death. As I've grown older, I think it does more harm than good in the long run. I think this is because we've always been allowed to ask about death, and we weren't shielded from it. We didn't watch mass tragedies or anything like that, but at dinner any topic was open for conversation, including loss. When my gran died, I was 6 or 7 at the time, and I went to his funeral. And like I've said before, I didn't make the connection that he was inside the box that people were all sad about. It was also my first exposure to real grief. When I saw the one and only time my mother hit my father to make him cry. I know it sounds bad and I can explain the story better another time.
Explain it now. That's okay.
David, my dad wasn't coping. He was denying his feelings and he started taking it out on everyone, us kids and my mum included. So a conversation between my parents turned into an argument. One thing led to another and she hit him. She didn't wallop him or anything like that. It was a slap. You couldn't even hear it. But it was just enough to make him cry. Force him to have that emotional release that he was denying himself. It really isn't as bad as it sounds. I think it only sticks out in my mind because it is the only time I ever saw my parents argue.
understand it. And I can process it because we were allowed to experience it. I wish that it was more common for adults to sit down and explain these things to children. Instead of saying things like, oh, they've gone away, or they're in a better place, or that they've gone on holiday. Just because the adult doesn't, or can't, I suppose, want to explain death to a child. When my dad died, my mother sat me and my sister down and just said plainly, your daddy's dead. Most people would shun that approach, but it stopped us from having questions on if he was coming back, and it sort of helped us with the grieving process. I think this to-the-point approach is because my mum had been shielded from experiencing death and loss from her parents. And she resented it, so she didn't really want her kids to go through the same. It's not really my story to share, so I don't want to explain it too much without permission. As for my thoughts on
I have
denying...
permission. Only want to hear it.
Yeah, it's okay.
Can you hold on to this one? Thank you.
Do you mind saying what you said?
Apparently not. I had a conversation with a friend. I asked her when she has children, she let them go to funerals. And she said it would depend on how old they are and who died. If it was a parent, a sibling, or grandparents, the child would go if they were old enough. But if you hit aunts and uncles, cousins, great grandparents, the child wouldn't be allowed to go until they were old enough. But she never gave me a specific age. My feelings are it's complicated, but if the child remembers that that person was in their life, and all of a sudden they're not there anymore, you should be allowed to go to the funeral. There's this weird misconception that children don't grieve just because it's a different grief to adult grief.
Yeah. It's kind of like with me. Like, obviously, you my grandma was there, and she wasn't there anymore. And I knew what a funeral was, and I wanted to go. But because I was 7, I wasn't allowed. It wasn't enough that I knew she'd gone. But would you let a 4-year-old go to a funeral if they knew that someone had gone?
It's tricky. It's definitely a tricky one. But most grown-ups I know don't cope with grief. Are they too young to go to funerals?
As for my thoughts on denying grief, I'm definitely a biased party on the subject. For 9 years I convinced myself that I wasn't grieving. I was over it. Mostly because of one bad experience with a teacher and a friend. My letter's getting long, so I can elaborate on this if you're interested. But by pretending I was fine was how I coped.
People don't talk about the overwhelming jealousy you feel.
Love, Jen.
Dear Gemma, I like how your family's approach to death is to be open and straightforward about it. I think it's important to address it head on and not dance around the subject. That's something I wish I could do with my family. I suppose that comes from a place of fear. People worry that by being too direct, they could cause upset. Being direct with it also makes it feel real. You have to face the reality of it when you might not be ready to. I'm interested to know more about your experiences of denial when it comes to grief. What made you realise you had been denying your grief for 9 years. Would you change anything, or do you think pretending you were fine was right for you at that time? How did you move away from that denial? What followed on from that? I know this would be difficult to predict and grim to think about, but do you think you would respond in the same way to another loss? Your experience of grief so far may have taught you things about the process, or even about yourself and what your coping mechanisms are. I can't answer that. I have. It's in a letter. But I can't answer that. Some other things I'm interested to know, which I'm happy to answer myself in future letters. Who are you most scared of losing? Have you had any experiences of grief that went from losing a loved one, possibly a pet, a friendship, moving? Can you ask the person who is grieving how the person died? Love, Victoria.
Dear Victoria, I realised I was grieving because I missed my dad. I was doing things with my life and I was doing them well, and it bothered me more and more that he would never know just how far I'd gone. Gemma, are you sure? Are you sure it's okay for me?
Why wouldn't it be okay?
It just doesn't feel right for me to be saying it. It feels like it's too private.
It's okay, I'm fine with you reading it. Remember, we agreed as long as we're both comfortable, we keep going with this, and I'm comfortable. I just don't feel that you are comfortable.
I just think it bothers you when I'm reading it.
I'm okay with you reading the letters. If I wasn't okay with you reading the letters, I would have never written them to you. And I did.
I know, but they're never meant to be shared, were they? You're a big group of people that have to hear about how much you died. And you can't agree with your family that you refuse to at the time. And when you want to, it's hard to know. You're guilty. You said before that you weren't sure if you're ready to be that vulnerable. If everyone to know. What is it you said? That you picked a solution. You know so many things about it, and you're the person who can go to help. Yeah? So, can I give you some advice? Give me some advice. Because if I've learned anything from my own grief and just doing this, you've got to just be able to feel your emotions, but if you're not ready to face them, just respect that. It's fine.
That's really lovely and really helpful advice. If that was my problem. I still struggle hearing about him and talking about my dad. I've only recently started calling him dad again. So I want people to know about him, I just can't do it. So Gemma, I'm sorry, but what time is it?
I was only 10 when we lost him. And it was so sudden, my brain did many weird things to protect me until I was ready to go. One of the weird ones being that I was sure I was 11 and not 10, because for some reason that made it more okay. The one thing I wish I could change was being able to talk about him sooner than I did. I refused to be in the same space as my family when they talked about him. And now they've all moved on from the conversations that I'm wanting to have now. And and it's indirectly hurting him. It makes me feel awful. I lost my nanny and my granddad while I was grieving. And I just didn't have the available emotions to grieve them individually. So it just added on to what I was already feeling for my dad. I miss them both, but it wasn't as difficult as losing my dad. How do you think you would react to a loss? To answer your last set of questions, I'm terrified of the day my mum will die. I think that will be worse than losing my dad at this present time. I've grieved so many things that weren't caused by death. My grandma and my grumps are one of those things. I can go into more detail if you want, but it would be best saved for another letter.
You cannot insult the dead.
Love, Jen.
Dear Gemma, thank you for sharing that with me. If I'm honest, I'm not quite sure how to respond. I suppose that just highlights my awkwardness around grief and other people's grief. I don't know whether I should acknowledge the things you told me about your dad or completely skim over them. I don't know how to acknowledge it. I don't know what the right thing to say is, and I don't want to say anything that is out of line. I know how it makes you feel when people say, "I'm so sorry." And that's the first phrase my mind goes to when someone talks about their loss. Even though I share the same feelings as you about that phrase. It's silly. Why are you sorry? It's not your fault. It's the only thing I know how to respond with. It's so easy to say. It doesn't go into too much depth, and it also doesn't encourage further conversation. It shows the slight sympathy people feel obligated to show, and then that's the end of it. Love, Victoria.
Dear Victoria, I have some questions for you. Is it just because you don't know much about grief that makes you uncomfortable talking about it? Have you grieved the loss of something that you didn't lose because of death? How do you feel about the portrayal of loss in TV, film and theatre? Love, Jen.
like they're very, very different. It doesn't mean that what was going on inside your head wasn't the same as me. I'm going to put money down on this table right now and say that rabbit was part of your family. Yeah. So you're allowed to grieve over it. If anybody's ever laughed at you for that, shame on them. Grief is grief. Bring me the letter. I've got my I just remember.
Dear Gemma, not knowing much about grief definitely contributes to how uncomfortable I feel when talking about it. I have also witnessed my mum acting this way when her parents died and are talked about, although I was able to talk to her the other day about my grandparents and she seemed okay sharing stories. We talked mostly about what it was like for her growing up. I think it's when we talk about them in their older age. That's when she gets upset. I reckon it's because she doesn't want to remember them that way. It was a difficult time, but I could be wrong. I think I have grieved to a certain extent when we moved from our childhood home. I lived there for 16 years and was distraught that we had to move. It felt like that chapter of my life had vanished, and we just had to start fresh. I was angry. I felt depressed in the new house. I would cry when I thought about the old one at first. I have no idea what to think about the portrayal of loss in movies and TV. I reckon it's quite dramatic, of course it would have to be. I don't know whether it's accurate or not, but I suppose it has shaped what I think about people experiencing grief. I've been exposed to more fictional grief than real grief. So I guess I struggle to understand what grief actually looks like. What about you? How do you feel about movies, TV, and grief? What about losing a pet? Is it silly to feel the way that I do? Why is all this bad shit happening? Love, Victoria.
Dear Victoria, I asked about grief in media and film because I wondered if you'd noticed how toxic it actually is. I wonder how many other people assume that grief on TV is similar to grief in real life. It's kind of like just go on a life-changing journey and then you'll all be better. Maybe this is why there's a time frame for us to grieve. And then people expect us to go back to how it was, go back to normal. I want to change the topic quickly. Are you okay? Genuinely. Talking about this every day of every week, personally, I'm starting to become exhausted from it. I want to put these questions out into the universe, I really do. But I'm starting to feel how draining it is. Maybe this is why people insist on not talking about grief. It's too exhausting to do. Maybe if people had been willing to talk, I wouldn't have so many questions. So, how are you feeling about all of this?
Death is the only selfish act that is easily forgiven.
Love, Jen.
Dear Gemma, I'm feeling drained, to be honest. I think this topic goes so deep and there are so many questions. And the answers to those questions are never simple. Or they generate even more questions. Talking about it and thinking about my own experiences of grief gets tiring after a while. You're right, it's exhausting. This whole thing has got me thinking about dying in a way I've never thought about before. I've always acknowledged I'm going to die, obviously, but I've started thinking about it in more depth and it's scary. Recently, every time we talk about grief, I start thinking about losing someone or my own death. How do you feel about dying? Love, Victoria. Dear Gemma, I know you've not replied to my last letter yet, but I forgot to say, isn't it funny how we said we'd stop if we got uncomfortable? But all we did was become comfortable enough with each other to become emotionally exhausted together. Love, Victoria.
Dear Victoria, who would have thought talking about our traumas together would make us this close? I am glad to tell people I've made a new friend there. I hope you feel the same. Lots of love, Jen.
I know we are supposed to finish it early. It's just that question.
Which question?
How do you feel about dying?
I mean, what else are you looking for? Do you want to know how I dread the day I'm gonna die because it means my family has to grieve for me? Or we could talk about how I'm terrified of having children because to this day, we don't know if what happened to my father or not was genetic and I could just drop at any second. Or we could talk about why people are more comfortable talking about death and dying rather than grief and grieving. I don't have a letter for you. I won't have a letter for that ever. But how about a toast? To everyone we have loved and lost, dying is inevitable. There's nothing I can do about it. But I feel I could do something about my family's grief. I just don't know what. Cheers.
Thank you for coming.
That's the end of our performance. We have provided you with leaflets that will take you to a website where you can go and read these letters for yourself. You can submit your own statements or thoughts, and there's also links to grief counselling there. We'll be around for the next 20-ish minutes if you want to come up to us and talk about anything we've mentioned, but do bear in mind we're not grief counsellors, so keep it about sort of what we've talked about. Thank you so much.